Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to welcome you to episode 195 of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. Today I visit with Gordon Firemark. Gordon is an entertainment lawyer in California, and Gordon has his own podcast where he talks about various issues relating to the entertainment industry, which he has been a part of. And he also has a podcast about lawyers. And he asked me to be on his podcast. And in this podcast, he visits with different lawyers about how they podcast, why they podcast, what they talk about in their podcast, the technical aspects of how they do their podcast. It's a very interesting experience to be interviewed for a change instead of being the one that's interviewed. And the podcast comes in at just over 23 minutes. Thank you.
This episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. You are in for a real treat today because I have been made acquaintance with Gordon Firemark. Gordon is an attorney in California who has a theater, film, television, and new media practice, and we met through our joint use and or love of podcasting. He spoke at Podcast Movement 2015, which many of you know I recently attended. And I got to know Gordon a little bit and wanted to see if he could visit with us about how he uses not only podcasting, but he's got a great social media presence. And I really wanted to talk to him about how he uses all of these tools in communication. So, Gordon, with that somewhat long-winded introduction, thank you very much for agreeing to come onto the podcast.
Hi, Tom. Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure. Thanks.
Gordon, as you know, I practice in the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act space, the FCPA. Your practices would be quite a bit different from mine, but nevertheless, on your law firm website, which is firemark.com, you have listed out your podcasts. You've got some product resource offerings, which you call filmmaker resources. You've got your LinkedIn presence. Looks like you answer some questions. It's just a wide variety of services and products, and I was very intrigued about how you use your platform, your social media platform, and your other platform to communicate with your client base.
Well, before we go into all that, I just want to say, yes, we have very different practice areas, but you'd be surprised to learn that I talk about FCPA with many of my clients because, they're going to shoot a film overseas and, there's no such thing as a film set where someone doesn't show up with their hand out asking for a bribe. So the FCPA does definitely apply to my clients. And, the scope of the advice I give them is it's illegal to pay those bribes. And beyond that, we don't really encounter it very much. But anyway, I just thought I'd share that. So.
Well, I'll leave you my phone number at the end of the podcast, and we can use that as joint marketing.
There you go.
So how did you come to podcasting, and how have you been able to use it in your practice?
Well, I was an early adopter of all of the various media technologies. The Internet came along, and actually right after I started my practice in the early 90s, I had a client who was making a series of instructional videos about this newfangled thing, the Internet. And they were called, cleverly enough, the Internet video. And in the course of working with him and watching these videos and learning about it, I got interested. And so I put up my own law practice website. It was really just a business card on the web back in mid-1993, so pretty early on in the game. And before too long, I decided, I was doing this print newsletter as a way of marketing my practice, this old school lawyer marketing, and I decided that I needed to put that content up on the web as well. And so I even figured out how to do a database-driven engine that would allow me to post my articles there and use that as the front end for my outbound marketing. And that sort of evolved, and that was basically a blog before there was such a thing as a blog. And, so as new technologies came along, as the blogging technology developed, I started adopting those things. And podcasting was eventually one of the things that sort of made sense. I was actually invited to be a guest on a podcast that a guy who his audience was mostly film and video makers. They were talking mostly about the cameras and the gear and the technique. But, you know, they would have law questions come up from time to time, and so he would bring me on, and we would do an episode of him asking me the questions, and I'd give answers, and pretty soon that evolved in us doing a regular show. And then he decided to go in a different direction with his career, and I felt the loss, so I started my own podcast in, I want to say, about 2007.
Wow, that's almost similar, or at least a little similar to my story, where I started a podcast with Howard Sklar, or Howard started it and asked me to be a part of it, called This Week in FCPA. As you now know, we lost Howard to the corporate world, and one morning woke up and said, I'd like to start my own podcast. So who is your primary client base, and how do you use your, not only your podcast, but your greater social media presence to communicate with them?
Well, I like to say that I represent, or my job is to help creatives and business people in the entertainment and media industries bridge that gap of the creative mindset to the business mindset. I was a film production background before I went to law school, and I was in the television business. And so I sort of know how people think on both sides of the lines, and I view it as my job is to sort of bridge that gap. So sometimes I'm representing the business folks, sometimes I'm representing the artists, the creators, the actors, writers, directors, and producers. And the good news is that in this space, the entertainment folks tend to be technologically inclined, you know, interested in media, interested in this stuff. And so they listen to podcasts, they read blogs, and they have been, and they do social media, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, those kinds of things. And now we're seeing some newer technologies coming up, and they're all excited about that. So being where they are has been important in the growth of my practice, and so being an early adopter has been beneficial for me.
I really liked what you said about bringing business solutions to both the business side and the creative side, because the tagline I have for my consulting practice is bringing business solutions to legal and compliance problems. So I really appreciate someone who understands that it's really bringing those business and creative people a solution to a legal problem, which is why they came to a lawyer in the first place. So,
nobody wants to hire a lawyer to solve to deal with a legal problem. They want a solution to whatever it is, and they don't care whether it's a lawyer who gives it to them or, you know, some guy on the street with an answer. So I might as well be both.
On your website, you've got a couple of drop boxes called filmmaker resources. And one is Indie Film Finance Guide. And then you've got a second one on how to get distribution for your indie film.
Mm-hmm.
Could you tell us about those and how you use those to communicate some of the legal concepts that you have to put out there for your client base?
Actually, those two products that you just mentioned are not my products. Those are advertisements that are on my site. I receive an affiliate commission when those particular products are sold. They happen to be produced by a friend and colleague of mine who's not a lawyer. He's a filmmaker. So I endorse those products. And I guess I probably have a compliance issue with the FTC rules there if it wasn't clear to you that that's the case. So I'll take a look at that. But I do have some other products of my own that I promote to the kinds of folks I work with. One is called Theater Producer Academy, for example, where I teach aspiring theater producers the ropes of that business. And really, I'm using video and audio and internet technology as a way of providing some sort of instruction on how to do things and where the issues arise and how to address them.
You've got just a plethora of different issues on your website available for anyone who wants to listen to them. How do you decide what issue? Do people pose questions to you? Is it something that interests you, or is it other?
Well, a little of both. Sometimes I'll be just, following along on the trades. And, one of my podcasts is called Entertainment Law Update. And so it's sort of my job with that show. My co-host and I do a monthly roundup of legal and entertainment law news. And in order to be ready for that each month, we are monitoring and tracking the news. And so sometimes I'll just see a topic that needs some attention, and that's how I'll decide to write a blog post about it. I do get a lot of questions. For a while, I was writing a column for another one of these online instructional groups called the Business of Show Institute, and they would send me questions. And they gave me permission to publish those on my blog as well, and that evolved into a Q&A series that I now do as YouTube videos, where each week I'll answer one question on video, just me talking to the camera, and tell them the question that's been posed, give them the answer, and sort of circle back with a call to action. Hey, ask your question here, and I'll try to answer that for you next time. And that's been really great for me. I think I get a lot of feedback that it's useful information. It's bite-sized pieces, which is valuable. So many lawyers, we all like to talk, and we all like to fill every silence with our voice. So keeping it short is attractive to the customers, the clients.
Gordon, I'm really intrigued by what you're doing because it relates to the kinds of concepts in FCPA compliance about communication. Mm-hmm. And FCPA compliance practitioners, whether they're a part of a corporate law department or a separate compliance department, they have a built-in constituency or a built-in client base, and that's their company's employees. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I'm trying to get across is there are just a lot of social media tools they're not using. Obviously, you and I use the social media tools of podcasting, of other communications through the internet, and some companies may not be comfortable with that, communicating to their employee base, both up the chain and down the chain. But there are also tools inside of a corporation, inside of an intranet. And many of the things I see you doing and using and talking about can be embedded inside of a company's intranet. Do you have any of your clients using any of those innovative techniques?
Well, most of my clients, one of the interesting things about the entertainment industry is that these are businesses that pop up and exist for, a few months or a year, and then they're sort of finished and all the employees go their separate ways. It's a business of independent contractors for the most part, who become employees temporarily while they're working on a film or a television show or something like that. And so they don't tend to build out infrastructure for those kinds of things. They tend to use the existing tools and technologies that are out there. I don't see anybody using podcasts per se as a way of communicating with their staffing for their shows and things, but I do see them using blogs and wikis and certainly social media, Twitter and tweet and Facebook and those kinds of things, setting up private groups as a way of communicating with their folks. But I think in the larger corporate environment, these are technologies that could be hugely valuable and very easy to implement in the scheme of things. The intranet, as you mentioned, or to have a password-protected website full of instructional content, informative, everything from your corporate policies and procedures manual could be available both in a print form, but also with, somebody explaining each chapter as a video or in an audio form. So, really making this stuff consumable for all types of learning styles. I think that would be terrific for in-house departments to be using.
In terms of your training, have you created a training series on your own around any of the legal issues that you counsel folks on?
Well, I have taught, as I mentioned, the Theater Producer Academy course, right? And I have a training program where I teach lawyers how to podcast, and that's not so much about the legal principles, although I do get into the discussion of the legal ethics of being highly visible and communicating out in the world and answering questions and those kinds of things, and a number of potential pitfalls there. But I've also taught at the law school level in an online format. There was an LLM program in entertainment law at Southwestern Law School where I attended, and I was hired to teach the theater law program in that LLM course, and so created a very comprehensive, if I do say so myself, course in theater law, and I found it a tremendously effective way to teach.
We both attended Podcast Movement 2015. I was wondering if you could share your experience at Podcast Movement 2015 and some of the highlights for you.
Well, I said to you before we were recording that that this was the very best conference I've ever attended. Now, of course, my frame of reference tends to be bar association kinds of conferences, so it's not a very high bar to get over.
Right.
But no, I really had a wonderful time. I felt like these were my people. Being a podcaster myself, I felt like I knew what I was dealing with, and these were like-minded folks, and it was just a lot of fun. Presenting there, I was really glad to have the opportunity to share my legal knowledge, my legal expertise in the new media space to help folks like that better understand the kinds of legal issues that can come up. And podcasting is a young enough medium that we haven't seen a lot of the troubles come up yet. We've been flying under the radar as podcasters for nearly 10 years now. And I think that's going to change. Podcasting is in the public eye much more than it was. And the time is right now for us to start thinking about this like business and thinking about these tools as not just fun ways to get the word out, but also possible points of exposure. And so that was the gist of my talk. But really, for me, the benefit of the whole thing was just the networking and socializing and learning from everybody else who's out there doing this stuff and getting some great ideas for technique and frankly, meeting other people too. I've been fortunate to guest on a couple of other people's shows as a consequence of being there, and I found a few guests from my shows through the conference as well, yourself included.
Yes, that you really made an interesting comment that you felt like you were among your people, the other podcasters, and I felt like a lawyer being there who happens to podcast. I felt very much like the outsider, and it's probably, it's not because they weren't friendly. It's just because I still think of myself as a lawyer, and so that's a very interesting observation, though, because I really felt like an outsider looking in, even though I've recorded over 200 podcasts. So maybe I need to shift my thinking somewhat or change my perspective.
Yeah, we each come to things with our own stuff, our own baggage, and I although I consider myself a lawyer, I try not to wear that as a shield or I'm a person who happens to be a lawyer, and I have other facets as well.
Well, I tell people lawyers are not people, we're lawyers, and maybe that's the difference. So one thing really,
Texans too, right?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
They say that about Texans also, right? Texans are not people, they're Texans.
Yep, I have to agree with that as well. So
I'm married to them.
Oh, even better. One thing I did want to ask on your website, you've got some information, a long paragraph factoid about the name Firemark. Why don't you tell us about that, because I found that very intriguing.
So people ask me about the name Firemark all the time, and I'm very fortunate to be really the owner of the name. There are no other Firemark families other than my close family anyway. My great grandfather was the immigrant from what's now somewhere in this what was the Soviet Union. I think it's sort of near Lithuania or Belarus. And we don't really know where exactly the town that he came from is. It's no longer on the maps. And when he entered the country through the immigration centers, not Ellis Island, but a similar immigration center, they were so jammed with people. This was just before the turn of the 20th century. That basically, if they couldn't pronounce your name on the second or third try, they just gave you a new name. And that's what happened. Firemark must be a phonetically sounding alike, or I guess it could be a meaning kind of a similarity too, but we think it was a phonetic sound alike to what the original name was. And so, he had his children and one son, and then that son had his children, and my grandfather was the only surviving son of 10 children. And then he had my father and a daughter, and my father had me as the only son, and now I have two sons, but they're both too small to have created any other Firemarks yet. So that's the origin of the name Firemark.
My grandfather.
Yeah, go ahead.
My grandfather immigrated from Italy, and when he got to America, they asked him his name, and he thought Fox was an American name, so he said his name was Fox. So that's how I got the name Fox.
Yeah, very interesting. Well, the other aspect of what you were talking about on my website was the origin of just the word Firemark, and
right.
It's interesting to us lawyers because a firemark, the noun, was a bronze plaque basically that was placed on a house by the insurance company that insured it against fire. And in the day that this was going on, each fire insurance company maintained its own fire department. And if the fire department arrived at your house and didn't see that you had the right insurance plaque on there, the right fire mark, they would let the house burn down. so fire marks are these bronze plaques. And my mother has a collection of bronze fire marks. It's on the wall in her living room.
In addition to podcasting, you are also an author, and you have written a book about podcasting entitled, I believe, The Podcast Blog and New Media Producers Legal Survival Guide. If I've read this correctly. Can you tell us about that and what you put into this book?
Well, it's really an ebook that I have also made available in print form, on a print-on-demand kind of a basis. I wrote it in 2010, and it's really due for an update. I think the update is going to be in the form of one of these other online course kinds of media rather than as a book this time around. The idea was, excuse me, back in 2010 when I decided to write this, this is when I was really getting deeply into podcasting and really understanding that folks who are doing this stuff don't know the legal aspects of it. I had been a entertainment lawyer, media lawyer for nearly 20 years at the time, and I know this stuff from the general larger media perspective, and really the same principles apply. It doesn't matter what kind of media you're making, privacy law, copyrights, trademarks, contract issues, all these kinds of things exist across the various media, and so we have to treat them appropriately. The problem is that podcasters then, and still to a certain extent now, don't have a big budget for hiring lawyers to give them the advice they need about these kinds of things. So I felt the need that there was need for a resource, and so I created it. I sat down over the course of a few months and wrote a chapter a day until it was sort of done. And if I had it to do over again, I think I'd hire an editor to make sure I communicated things a little more effectively. But I think it's a pretty good piece, and it's available at podcastlawbook.com.
Well, Gordon, I really appreciate you taking the time to visit with me. I'm very impressed on your use of social media in your website and in your practice and how you communicate. We obviously met through a social media tool of podcasting, and I think we could both share with the audience that we both love the medium and love both the production part and listening to them as well, certainly on my end. So but I was wondering if anyone wanted to contact you directly on anything you talked about in this podcast, could they do so, and if so, how?
Well, the best way to find me is my website. Fortunately, I have this great last name, Firemark, and firemark.com is the website I started back in 1993 that I mentioned. So you can find me at firemark.com. My email address is gfiremark@firemark.com. If you're interested in my podcasts, they are Entertainment Law Update and the Law Podcasting Podcast, which is found at lawpodcaster.com. And I have a course teaching lawyers, as I mentioned, how to do podcasting. And frankly, if anybody's interested in starting a podcast, I think it's a great resource. It's at lawpodcasting.com. And on most social media, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and so on, gfiremark is the handle.
Well, Gordon, thanks very much for coming on the podcast, and I look forward to continuing the dialogue in the future, and hopefully we'll catch up with you at the next podcasting conference.
Absolutely, Tom. It's been great to be here, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. Please do not forget my upcoming FCPA Masterclass. There's still a couple of slots open. If you want to sign up, it's September 10th and 11th in Houston. You can contact me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. I'd also ask you to go to iTunes and rate this podcast. I would greatly appreciate it. And finally, if you have any questions, please send them to me for my upcoming mailbag episode. I appreciate you listening to this episode. Thank you.